Okay. Well, we are excited to have Linda Faddis with us today to talk about Israel and a few, maybe a few other things. But we're excited that she's here. It's my understanding that she used to be. Am I correct that you used to be part of the congregation here? Okay. Okay. All right. I wanted to make sure I got that right. Well, we're excited that you're here, and this time you've got the floor. All right.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here today. Can y'all hear me all right? Then I might not need that speaker. But I've made some notes because I knew that getting in front of folks that I wouldn't be able to remember everything. I haven't. Oh, I thought Mark was behind me. He's back there in the seat already. Oh my. Well, I'm just real thankful to be here today, and I'll start to. Oh, all right. All right. Well, all right. Actually, I think I'll have to, because I have to hold notes, read the Bible, and hold the speaker. That's better.
I don't think this is large enough here.
Here, I'll hold it. I'll try. I'll give it a go. I'd like to start off with a scripture that is so perfect for our time. Can you hear me all right? Okay. Oh, I'm not used to these things. In the book of Isaiah, he wrote, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." And that seems to be the way the world is today. And with Hamas being celebrated all over the world for the things that they have done, for the lawlessness, and for all of these things that we're seeing in our world today. But, I gotta get used to holding this thing. Just bear with me. I need to use my notes because I might not be able to remember everything, and these things are very important that I want to share with you. And I have some sources that I'd be happy to share with you after the service. Folks that I've been in touch with that have given me a lot of information. Today it is day number 268 of the current war in Israel with Hamas. We'll start with October the 6th of 2023. It was the day before that terrible attack happened. The Israelis were celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, which is found in Leviticus 23, if you want to read about that. It's one of the wonderful feast days that they celebrate every year. Now, the next day, on October the 7th, they were going to celebrate another holiday. The Israelis love to celebrate all holidays. This holiday was called Rejoicing in the Lord, rejoicing in and joy in the Torah. That's a celebration of, each year they celebrate this after reading the 5 books of Moses and studying those from Genesis to Deuteronomy. The feast days and the holidays in Israel are all considered the Sabbath day. Now, this morning we'll be talking about the terrorist groups in and around Israel. The first one is Hamas. They're based in Gaza, where the current war is. Now, Hamas in the Hebrew language means violence, very befitting. The next is Hezbollah terrorist group. They're based in Lebanon. And on Thursday of last week, the governments of Germany, Netherlands, and Canada urged all their citizens to leave Lebanon because the war is starting to escalate there. The Hezbollah is sending a barrage of missiles into Israel, and it seems to be getting worse. The third terrorist group is called the Houthis. Now, they're based in Yemen. Now, their battles are mainly out at sea targeting ships. But our American ships have intercepted well over 100 of the missiles that they have sent out just since January of this year. Now, all of these terrorist groups are funded by Iran, and they're all proxies of Iran as well. Now, the Russians are getting in on this too because they have established a military base on the border of Israel and Syria. Now, they're being quiet right now, but their silence is becoming very loud. They're building up in the Red Sea as well. Now, over the past few years, Hamas in Gaza has sent out well over 20,000 missiles into Israel. Now, just weeks before October the 7th of 23, and that terrible attack, reports started coming into Israel concerning an imminent attack from the Hamas. Then it was just days later, on October the 7th, that at 2:45 a.m., an urgent message came in to the Israeli defense officer that this would be an imminent attack from Hamas out of Gaza. Now, this was the first urgent message that they had received, but they had received quite a few other notices about an imminent contact. Now, the officer that received this message, he and his wife were on a holiday. They laid it on the table and thought that they would get it to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that next day. And so they laid it on the table, and they were going to have their celebration along with everyone else. Not really knowing the mindset of all these people receiving these imminent messages, but had they become so accustomed to all the missiles flying into Israel that they just didn't regard this last message as urgent. Now, in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 33, now when you have time, read that, because he speaks of the watchman, and he gives a very stern warning to those who ignore it. Now, with real messages coming in with urgent, imminent reports, where were the watchmen to sound the alarm and to warn the people, their fellow man? Since then, there's been a few resignations, and after the war is over, there's going to be a whole lot of resignations in the Israeli government. Separating Israel from the Gaza Strip was a $1 billion iron-gated fence that took about 3 years to build. Now, real close by the fence was a Jewish community called a kibbutz, where they have farming and gardening. There's quite a number of people that live in those areas, and their homes are fairly close together. Also, in a nearby open field was a group of young adults and older teens, over 3,000 of them, and they were there for a music festival and camping and also celebrating the holidays for about a week. Things seem to kind of shut down in Israel when a holiday comes, and it's only the emergency staff that are available usually. The terrorist Hamas was starting to make their move now. It was early on a Saturday morning, October the 7th, at 6:30 a.m. when the terrorist struck. It was just a little over 3 hours ago from the time that the defense officer had received that urgent message. It was still laying on the table. And now Israel's $1 billion fence was starting to crumble as the terrorists pulled through with bulldozers and the drones started dropping bombs on it. Tons of missiles were flying everywhere, and Hamas was, they were shooting at everything and anyone. The enemy started to drive through that broken down fence in their jeeps, trucks, and also their motorcycles. As they drove through that fence, now they headed straight for that Jewish community. Now the brutal massacre started, and every kind of torture was done to the men, women, children, and even little infants. Those evil terrorists didn't spare anyone from that dreadful morning. At the same time that Hamas did that, there were Hamas coming in on hang gliders in that open field where all the young folks were. They started killing, torturing, and kidnapping many of them. That morning, in just a couple of hours, over 1,300 people were killed and many were badly wounded. A very elderly woman that survived all of it, she was around 90-something. She said she got a close look at some of the terrorists, and she said they looked wild and like they were demon-possessed. She was also a survivor of the Holocaust, so she has really seen some dark days. Now, there are some good Palestinians, and there are many who fight with Hamas, and there are some Christian Palestinians. Now, the terrorists will shoot and kill anyone, any of the innocent civilians if they know that they're not on their side. And they also use the humans as human shields. They even use the children as human shields. Now, the Hamas have their headquarters under hospitals, under the UN building, in schools and apartments and so on. And they have a massive underground system. It's like a little city underground. Now, before the Israelis went into battle in Gaza, they dropped leaflets to all the Palestinian people to clear the area because they were coming in for battle. Now, we Americans did the same thing when we were in war with Japan in World War II. Now, one of the news agencies in Gaza is called Al Jazeera, and they're sending out reports all over the world about statistics and things that are happening, and a lot of it is misinformation about the statistics, because the folks that I hear from are a search and rescue unit that are based out of Tel Aviv, but they're in Gaza every day along with the Israeli army and also the police special forces. And so they give the accurate statistics and all the information that's very accurate, but sad to say, it doesn't get out to too many news stations. Now, that morning on October 7th is one of the darkest days in Israel. And we can sit back and think to ourselves, how could this happen to the mighty Israeli army that at one time knocked out massive Arab armies? They knocked them out of action with some of their very bold ground maneuvers. Now, the Israelis have been very successful with the air defense system. It's called the Iron Dome, that can knock out short-term or short-range missiles. They also have something called the David Sling, a system that can knock out mid-range missiles. Now, you know where that name came from. When King David killed Goliath with his slingshot. They also have what's called Arrow 2 and 3, a defense system that can knock out longer-range ballistic missiles. But with Hezbollah sending so many missiles in one after the other, I think it's starting to jam up some of these air defense systems, and so that's something that we'll have to consider. Now, as the war rages on with Hamas, let's pause for a moment and think about the Palestinian people and who they are anyway. To understand that, we'll have to go back to the year 135 when the Romans were in control. Now, the Roman emperor at that time was Hadrian, and he really had a dislike for the Jews. He wanted to change the culture and their identity, and so he renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and then he renamed all the people there Palestina, which is Latin for Philistines. It was the enemy of Israel during biblical times. Now, the Romans had a province at one time in the land of the Philistines. So that's where the Palestinians got their name, and it was out of hatred. Now, there's a lot of history back then, but for the sake of time, we'll step forward to around 1917, pre-World War II and the Holocaust. Now, the British are now in control, and I think of you, Judy, because I remember hearing you when a famous line that I remember hearing you say, when the British General Allenby walked through the streets of Jerusalem, you knew that the British are now in control. And that was in 1917, and they stayed until between 1947 and 1948, when Israel became an independent country in 1948. Now, this is very important. During the British rule in Jerusalem, there was a high-ranking Muslim called the Grand Mufti. Now, the Grand Mufti makes legal decisions about religious matters. They still have them today. Now, the Grand Mufti was the uncle of Yasser Arafat. Remember him? Now, the Grand Mufti was making plans for the Palestinian people back then and was planning the future of Yasser Arafat. Now, continuing on with his plan, that Grand Mufti actually went to Germany in the mid-1930s to meet with Hitler and to discuss how to eliminate the Jewish people. Now, after that meeting, the Mufti went back to Jerusalem and continued planning regarding the Palestinian people. Now, Yasser Arafat at that time was only 10 years old, and he was an Egyptian born in Egypt. He was not a Palestinian. He was part of the big plan to infiltrate Gaza. Now, during the next 30 to 40 years, Arafat was going to be prepped and primed, for his new role in Gaza when the time comes for him to go. It was after World War II and the Holocaust when the Jews started coming back to the Holy Land. They were coming in from all over Europe, Ethiopia, the U.S., and India. There were many languages spoken at that time, and for many years the Hebrew language had been used only for religious services by the rabbi and prayers and just things within the synagogue. Now the prophet Zephaniah in our Bible had prophesied about restoring the language and also about the Ethiopians going to Israel. Now a Jewish man that was born in Ethiopia back in the 1800s answered the call of God. He and his family went to Israel in the late 1800s, and they stayed there teaching the Hebrew language until his death in 1922. So there was prophecy being fulfilled. Now, my mother and some of our mothers were born in the early 1900s, so it's really amazing to think that prophecy was being fulfilled in our time, some of our time anyway. Now, when he arrived in Israel, he had quite a challenge ahead of him, but with the help of God, he wrote a dictionary in Hebrew, also newspaper articles, and started conversing with everyone in Hebrew. Now, in the Ethiopians were flying into Israel in 1970s up to the mid-1990s, I believe it was, and still coming in. Now, in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9 and 10, you can read about that. It's very interesting. In Ethiopia, I have a very interesting story, but I don't have time this morning. I've got a story about the former Emperor Haile Selassie back in Ethiopia. And sometime I'd like to share that with you. It'll warm your hearts. Now, with many of the Jewish people back in the Holy Land, they started to prepare for the statehood. Now, while the British were pulling out, the Israelis were secretly starting to buy weapons of war. They were buying used airplanes, used machines, everything was used, and they were buying these things from Czechoslovakia, which is now called Slovakia. Now, the airborne smuggling missions were all done. They were carried out by Americans. An American, Al Schwimmer, actually recruited and trained fighter pilots in Israel. Now, the Israelis wanted to keep it secret because they didn't want the rest of the world to know that they did have a real tiny military at one time, and they were trying to build it up. Now, before they started buying all these things, the Israelis only had like 2 or 3 warplanes, and it was, one of the planes was like you operated it with a stick. You could guide it with a stick, and with the other hand, you could open the window and throw a bomb out. So that's the kind of equipment that they had. Now, statehood finally arrived in May of 1948. Now, our President Truman was the first leader in the whole world to call and congratulate them and recognize them as an independent country. Now, the celebration didn't last very long because they, within weeks, were attacked by 5 Arab countries. Now, some of the men and women had been in the British military, so they had some experience. Now, it was during the battle when a platoon of Israeli soldiers wandered onto a minefield. It would soon be daylight, and they would be sitting ducks for the enemy. So they started to pray and ask God for help. Then suddenly a very strong wind started blowing. Sand and dirt were blowing all over the place, and it was growing in intensity. Then in 20 minutes it stopped, and all the landmines were exposed. The troops walked off the minefield unharmed, and they were thanking God for the victory. Now going forward to 1960, and it's time for Yasser Arafat to make his move. He's been prepped and primed to become the very first leader in Gaza. He started the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and he was in Gaza until his death around 2004, and then another leader came on then called Abbas. But I'm sure you remember hearing so much about Yasser Arafat when he was there in Gaza, their very first leader. Now, just a short time later, the winds of war were starting up again in Israel in 1967, just a couple years later. At this time, there was a very ominous radio announcement coming out of Cairo, Egypt. The Egyptians said, and I quote, "The existence of Israel has continued too long. The battle has come now in which time we shall destroy Israel." And so that was a direct quote from him. Now, along with Egypt in that battle was Syria and Jordan, and also Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Algeria, a whole slew of them. Now, Israel got wind of this immediately, and they started a plan that would rely on speed and accuracy, and most of all, with the help of God. They named that plan Operation Moked, simply meaning stay focused. I need to hang that in my room. Stay focused. Now, the 1960 war that was coming then was also called the Six-Day War. Remember that? I used to listen to that on the radio. Now, the plan kicked off, and Israel came on like a huge, overwhelming force. Now, with the help of God, just listen to what happened during those 6 days. The aging, smuggled used planes that they had gotten in that weren't quite up to speed started flying perfectly well. The pilots were able to knock out 453 of those Egyptian planes, plus a whole mess of Jordanian tanks. And then a few truckloads of the enemy confronted some of the Israeli soldiers, and they all froze. They weren't able to get a shot fired off. And then some of the older weapons that were used that had malfunction started working without a hitch. Now, isn't that something? Now, the enemy shells making a direct hit on this munitions pile failed, and not a one went off. Now, out in the desert, the enemy said that they saw thousands of Israeli tanks, and they pulled back. But there were actually only 2 or 3 tanks, and this miracle happened. They saw a desert mirage which showed thousands of tanks, and it played tricks on their eyes. Now, isn't that something what God did? One last amazing miracle at that time. During the war, the enemy reported seeing a very bright, blinding light and loud, shrill noises, and they were frightened. They backed off. It was later revealed that Israel was nowhere in that area. It was God fighting the battle. The Israelis then thanked God in his supernatural intervention, and he had given them the victory. Now, now listen to this. In those 6 days of war, Israel took back the Golan Heights from Syria. They took back the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Then they took back the old city of Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria from Jordan. And the operation was very successful thanks to Almighty God. By the way, Egypt took back that Sinai Peninsula. It was due to a peace treaty back in 1979 that they signed with Israel. But someday we're going to get it back. So many wars have been fought in and around Israel. And there's a war that happened, and I'd like for you folks to read about this because we don't have, for the sake of time, we're not going to have time this morning, but for the sake of time, what I'd like for you folks to do is go to 2 Chronicles when you get home. It's the whole chapter, and read about that. It was when Jehoshaphat was the king of the southern kingdom, and Judah was in that southern kingdom along with Benjamin and part of the tribe of Levi. And they had heard about a massive enemy army coming to attack. They went to the house of God and prayed, but how they pulled this off without a hitch, all the enemy got killed, and they didn't even have to raise an arm. But read about this because it's amazing. I'll just give you a little clue. In the temple, they had some wonderful male singers. They were from the tribe of Levi. And they had arranged for these singers to march with King Jehoshaphat's group, Judah. Now, Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. And so you know God was going to be with them. But the singers got in front of all these troops, and as they started marching to where the enemy was, they were singing loud to the top of their lungs, and they started praising the Lord. Well, the enemy, can you imagine what the enemy thought? They got so confused, they didn't know what was coming off. They got confused, and a lot of the enemy armies didn't know each other because they had come from different places. And the leaders of these enemy armies had planned to where they can converge and get together for this battle. So these enemy soldiers, being confused like that, well, they turned on one another and started fighting and killing, and they did them all in, each one of them. They all fought each other, and they killed each other. So that's in 2 Chronicles 20. Just read all about that. Well, I guess just one more quick little thing, and then that'll be it for this morning. I've got so many stories to tell, I could be here till supper time and when the cows start coming home. But just one more quick thing I wanted to share because this is important and the news doesn't cover it. Iran had originally ordered all 3 terrorist groups to attack Israel on October the 7th in 3 different locations. But for some reason, the wires got crossed and only Hamas attacked. It would have been far worse. Now, Iran was Persia until 1935, but in the Bible there's a lot about Persia. And in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 49, there's things that he has written about Elam. Elam was the grandson of Noah, and he and his people went to what was then Persia, but the name of that area changed. But in the town where Elam was, that's where they have all those nuclear sites. So one of these days, there's going to be a real showdown in that part of Iran. Now, that's the place where Queen Esther and Nehemiah were also. They were in what the Bible says was Susa, and that's where Daniel is buried also. But of course, when they changed everything around, they changed the name of the town to what is called Shush. So that's If you ever look on a map, look for Shush, and that's in that area. But, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I'd like to come back sometime, but don't wait too long. I'll be going on 85 pretty soon. And while I got my right mind. It's so good to be with you folks. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.